Okay, everyone. I now have great pleasure in introducing Lorraine Mepham, our top finds boffin at Wessex Archaeology, to discuss the pottery of the area.
Thanks very much, Bill. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me along today. And it's really nice to be here. And to try and sneak a bit of material culture into the day. It's also quite nice now to be able to link up the talks that Phil has given with what Chris has said and what Alex will no doubt say later. So I'm going to be filling in a bit of the ceramic background to those. And what I'm going to be talking about is pottery recovered from various locations at Old Sarum and across Salisbury. And this pottery has revealed a sequence running from possibly as early as the 10th, 11th century, right through to the medieval period and beyond. But the move from Old Sarum to the new city in the early 13th century is mirrored in a change in the patterns of pottery production and distribution. And that is really what I'd like to explore today, and how it's reflected in the archaeological record and what that might mean. So just briefly, the evidence that I'm going to be relying on. Now, in 1890, General Pitt Rivers, who's often referred to as the father of modern archaeology, publishing the results of his excavations at Tollard Royal, said that there are conditions in which they, referring to his illustrated medieval pots, afford the only evidence available, even in medieval times, and a more thorough knowledge of them that we possess would be desirable. Now, sadly, this advice was not followed up by William Hawley when he excavated at Old Sarum between 1909 and 1915, and large quantities of the pottery from his excavation were dumped and spread over the outer wailing of the castle. Only a small fraction of the pottery excavated there ever found its way into the museum collections, and the provenance of the pieces that are here is uncertain. There's fortunately more evidence from Stone and Charlton's excavations of two Norman cesspits in the 1930s. They published selected pots from these cesspits, although the descriptions of the fabrics are pretty basic and there's no overall quantification. But their excavations were significant in providing one of the very few pieces of independent dating evidence for the pottery from Old Sarum, and indeed for the area as a whole for the Saxo-Norman period, in other words between the 10th and 12th centuries. And this came in the form of a coin of William I, which was found at the bottom of one of the cesspits. Now, further unquantified groups have been published by Philip Ratz and John Musty from excavations in the late 1950s. And since then, there had been no systematic fieldwork at Old Sarum of any scale until Alex Langman's trial trenching in 2018 and 2019. So I'm basing most of my discussion of the pottery from Old Sarum on Alex's assemblage of just under 5,000 medieval sherds. And those were recovered from the extramural settlement from these trial trenches across the western suburbs. So this, thanks Alex for lending me this illustration here. Alex's test pits were located in this area, so running down Phillips Lane here, test pits on the top, and along Stratford Road along the bottom. Now, the trial trench data has some limitations which I ought to make you aware of. The assemblage includes wear types that could be dated between the 11th and 13th centuries, possibly slightly earlier and possibly beyond that. But several of the types have fairly lengthy currencies that mean the assemblage cannot be neatly divided into closely datable slices that pre- and post-date the foundation of Salisbury. But nevertheless, by comparison with other sites in the region and by the appearance of certain chronologically distinctive wares and vessel forms, it's possible to provisionally identify pottery groups that may belong to the 11th to 12th century, with some possibly earlier sherds from the 10th or 11th century. Now, from Salisbury, as Phil Harding has described, there have been a number of excavations across the city from the mid-1980s onwards, and from which I've taken data from the Wessex archaeology projects, and particularly the larger ones, and that's amounted to just over 7,000 medieval sherds. Now, this seems an astonishingly low figure for over 30 years' worth of excavation. But I can assure you that we didn't follow Worley's example and spread our pottery over the city. The pottery from Salisbury itself belongs overwhelmingly to the period after the founding of the new town in the 1220s, as you might expect. But some sites have produced the odd few sherds that could be earlier. And there have been other excavations, not by Wessex archaeology, but have picked up early material from around the area of St Martin's Church in the southeast of the city, where settlement is believed to predate the medieval foundation. So let's just try and set the ceramic evidence in its regional background and summarise what we know, what's the current state of knowledge. Now, despite Pitt Rivers' initiative in 1890 and Stone and Charlton's recommendation in 1935 that the time has now arrived when a closer classification should take place of English earthenware of the 11th and 12th centuries, it's still fair to say that our knowledge of late Saxon and Saxo-Norman ceramic sequence is a bit sketchy, to say the least. Within Wiltshire, we have a few excavated assemblages, none of them particularly large, and as for Old Sarum, the stratified proportion is even less. Perhaps the best stratified assemblage from this period is up here at Trowbridge, from excavations by Wessex archaeology, and there are similar groups from Warminster, Avebury up here, Amesbury, Wilton and Old Sarum itself. Or there's one at Market Lamington here. Evidence for pottery manufacture at this period is even scantier. There's nothing definite within the county. There are two excavated pottery kilns here at Micklemarsh, near Romsey in Hampshire. One excavated in the late 1960s and the other in 2001 by Wessex archaeology on the route of a pipeline. And these kilns at Micklemarsh were producing very distinctive wheel-thrown wares. Most of the pottery in circulation at this time would have been handmade. And one of the Micklemarsh kilns has an archaeomagnetic date in the late 10th to 11th century, so that's a nice fixed point. And the rest, unfortunately, is built on very patchy evidence and surmise. It's maybe worth pointing out here that when Gina Patterell surveyed documentary sources for pottery manufacture in the late 1960s, she noted just 3 references in Domesday for the whole country. Now, that's unlikely to reflect the real state of potting in the late 11th century. It's more likely to be a reflection of the capriciousness of the survey, which ignored potters in many places where they were almost certainly operating at the time. It might have had something to do with the fairly low status of potters within society at the time, and indeed later. But one of these 3 references is in Wiltshire, and it's at Westbury up here, which suggests that the reference suggests that there was a small group of potters working there at that time. As for the rest, there are a few other types that we can identify and possibly relate to sources or source areas. And perhaps for those of you that are not familiar with pottery analysis and the way that we as archaeologists go about looking at pottery, when I talk about types or ware types, I'm talking about types that we can distinguish on the grounds of texture, on the basis of the clay that's being used, and things that might be occurring naturally within that clay or have been added deliberately by the potter in terms of temper to strengthen the clay. So this is how we divide pottery up. So in terms of the other types that we know about at the time, there's another wheel-thrown type circulating in the late 11th century. rather confusingly known as cheddar type. Now cheddar's way over here in Somerset. It was defined on the basis of evidence from the Saxon royal palaces there. But in fact, petrological analysis has suggested various sources either in the Blackdown Hills, north of Taunton, so off the map here, or somewhere in central or south Wiltshire. So we're not very clear about that. There are micaceous wares, so wares made with clay containing flakes of mica, circulating across West Wiltshire from at least the 11th century. And these have a possible source at Crockerton. That's this little star here, outside Warminster. Now, potters are mentioned here in documentary sources from 1234, although this reference implies that the industry was already in existence by the second half of the 12th century. As well as that, there are Oolitic wares containing fragments of Oolitic limestone circulating in this part of North Wiltshire, possibly originating at Minety or the surrounding area. And these were there from at least the 11th century, although possibly originating earlier. And it's possible that similar wares were also being made nearby at Great Somerford, Wootton Bassett and Lynham, where there are tenuous evidence. There are also flint-gritted and chalk and flint-gritted wares known as Kennet Valley or Newbury wares, found across a wide area of West Berkshire and North East Wiltshire from the 11th century onwards, and they were probably made at a number of sources, of which one possible source has been identified here on place name evidence in the Southern Black Forest south of Marlborough. But the majority of assemblage from Old Sarum is made up of coarse sandy wares, often scratch marked, and these I now term Wessex coarse wares. They were the precursors to the coarse wares that were made in the Laverstock kilns from the 13th century onwards. We don't know where they were made, but it's almost certainly somewhere in the vicinity of Old Sarum. Now, I was quite hopeful when Chris and Don were doing their surveys, their archaeomag surveys outside Old Sarum. I was hoping that they might pick up a few kilns around there because that would be a prime site, but unfortunately they let me down. So, try harder. So these wares, these Wessex coarse wares, seem to have appeared in the area sometime about the 11th century, possibly pre-conquest, possibly post-conquest. But they may have been a continuation of an earlier tradition across southeast Wiltshire and East Dorset, possibly going back as early as the mid-Saxon period. So that's the state of our evidence. Now, in terms of what we'd actually found at Old Sarum, the inhabitants seem to have been supplied with a range of pottery types here from sources across a wide area of Wessex, both local and more distant. And this does seem to be the case for other settlements of the period across Wiltshire and beyond. So there's a broad overlap in distribution areas between the different types. Now these two diagrams here are both unfortunately slightly deceptive, and this goes back to the limitations of the assemblage which I touched on earlier. Diagram on the left-hand side takes in the whole assemblage from Old Sarum. So this potentially has a date range spanning the period from the 11th century, possibly slightly earlier, through to the 13th century and beyond. It's a sort of palimpsest, if you like, of everything. Now, to try and narrow that down a bit further, I extracted everything that I knew was definitely later than 13th century. So I took out some of the glazed wares, which I knew were 13th century or later. And that gave me this diagram on the right. But in this case, I suspect that this proportion here of the Wessex coarse wares is overemphasised. And this is because I can't necessarily date those wares within that overall time period. They just didn't change enough in terms of texture. I can only date them when I've got something a bit more diagnostic to hang a date onto. So if I've got a rim for something a bit more diagnostic. So, although it does demonstrate that there were several different types in circulation at the time, I suspect that this proportion is really underestimated in this diagram here. So let's have a look at what these pots actually look like. And here's a typical range from the period. Now the two on the left-hand side here, these are generic for the period, so these aren't local. I've just taken them as typical examples. So we've got a pitcher here for serving drink at a table and a jar or cooking pot here. Now these are from our area. These are two pots from the Micklemarsh kilns, a spouted pitcher here with decoration on top, and a jar or cooking pot here. These are both wheel thrown. These would have been handmade. And with the addition of a few dishes and a few lamps, this does make up a quite limited repertoire for the period. So the range of sources that might have been supplying Old Sarum is not necessarily reflected in the range of the vessel forms, the shapes of pottery made. Each source would have been producing more or less the same range of pots. And these few vessel forms could have supplied all of the needs within the basic domestic sphere: food storage, food preparation, food serving, with some vessels probably fulfilling more than one function. Now, is it possible to say anything more about the sequence of pottery at Old Sarum? And a couple of the questions earlier were touching on this, and I might be able to add a little bit more to the discussion here. Now, remember, we've got a fixed point in the coin of William I, found at the bottom of the cesspit by Stone and Charlton, which gives a terminus post quem for the contents. Now, pottery from this cesspit included scratch-marked Wessex courseware, the Laverstock precursors, but it's impossible from the published descriptions or illustrations to tell if any other ware types were present. But if we look at the trial trenches along Phillips Lane and along Stratford Road, there are some differences that we can pick out. Again, I'm indebted to Alex for this illustration. Now, the ware types here are arranged more or less in chronological order. Don't worry if you can't read the captions. Starts with Romano-British at the top and runs through to post-medieval at the bottom. But the bits I'm interested in are here, the sort of orange, yellow and green to brown range here. So we can see that the wares that might be expected to fall within the 10th to 11th century range, and these are the orange Micklemarsh type, some chalk-tempered, flint-tempered, mixed grit and cheddar type, so the orange to green range. And we can see that they seem to congregate here, they focus here along the road, whereas they don't really appear very much up here. There's a little touch in that trench there, but otherwise they seem to focus in this area here. Whereas the test bits here, further up Phillips Lane, they don't have so much of this range, but they do have much more in terms of the Wessex coursewares, some of the fine wares which we know are 13th century or later, and this green wedge here are the Crockerton types, the micaceous types that we know were circulating from the 12th century. So these test pits here, as Chris has already alluded to, seem to span the period from 12th to 13th century. And again, some of these also will contain 12th to 13th century, as well as some of those earlier wares. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to Salisbury and the Laverstock kilns. So we've seen that settlement at Old Sarum undoubtedly continued into the 13th century. Incidentally, I think it's probably likely on the pottery evidence, as Chris already said, that settlement there fell off quite rapidly after the foundation of the new city, probably by around mid-13th century. There's a little bit of later evidence, but it's fairly sporadic. But from the early part of the century, the 13th century, the supply of ceramics does change quite dramatically in the Salisbury area. The new town here was founded in the 1220s, and shortly afterwards this production centre here at Laverstock was established. 10 kilns have been excavated here. They lie under what is now a housing estate, but almost certainly there were other kilns around. Certainly field walking around this area has produced masses of sherds, so it's likely there are more kilns there. And there is an outline kiln in Salisbury itself, possibly quite short-lived at the latter part of the 13th century, and possibly founded by a potter moving from the kilns into the city. Now, the main stimulus for the establishment of the kilns here at Laverstock was undoubtedly the demand from the new town. But there was also another very important consumer up here at Clarendon Palace, where Henry III was making extensive refurbishments and embellishments from the 1230s. So in fact, Laverstock's fairly well situated to serve both the new town and the palace, roughly midway between the two. Let's review the evidence that we've got from this slightly later period. So from this period onwards, Laverstock here really starts to dominate the market. And across the sites excavated by Wessex archaeology in the city, those wares make up 95% approximately of the total pottery found. The orange segment is the coarse wares, the green segment is the fine wares. I'll explain a bit more what I mean about that distinction a little later on. The other sources are almost entirely squeezed out. These would have included the micaceous wares from the Crockerton area, the chalk and flint gritted wares possibly coming from the Southampton forest, and also the oolitic wares coming from the north of the county. One other kiln centre is known at this period at Laycock, Nash Hill. As far as I know, there have been no Nash Hill wares identified in Salisbury at all. And here's what they would have been making at Laverstock. Here's a nice selection of pots here. Basic repertoire remains more or less the same. So jugs for serving drink at the table, jars for cooking pots, bowls and dishes, some of them with added handles to adapt them for cooking. The jars are still scratch marked, as you can see here. But the jugs show a new vibrancy and the use of coloured slips and glazes. And importantly, there is a distinction now, as I've just alluded to, between the fine wares used for the jugs and the coarse wares used for the utilitarian kitchenwares, in terms of the clay that's used and in terms of the way that clay has been treated. The jugs are made using a fine version of the clay, smooth to the touch, and typically firing a sort of pale, creamy beige, pale salmon pink colour. Kitchenwares were using the same clay, but they generally have a coarse sand element added to them, sand just added to the clay when working, and to give a much coarser clay. And it's not just in the decorated jugs that the Laverstock potters showed innovation. You do get a range of new vessel forms added to the basic repertoire at this time. So we have the skillets that we see here, previous photo. We've got pipkins, bottles, as you can see here, curfews or fire covers, aquamanils here, very fancy vessels used for serving liquids, costrels here for holding and transporting liquids, more lamps, And these rather odd vessels here, this is a profile here of what's known as a West Country dish. Essentially it's the top half of a jar cut off with a flat base. We're not quite sure what they were used for. There were undoubtedly outside influences on these changes. So the deliberate use and treatment of pale firing clays and the use of elaborate coloured slip decoration, seen in many pottery industries across southern England in the 13th century. These all took their ultimate inspiration from pottery imported from France. Interestingly, and somewhat paradoxically, there's practically no evidence for the presence of any continental imports in Salisbury. I've recorded 4 small sherds, probably all Saintonge wares from central France, from 30 years worth of excavations. That's not very much really. Although small quantities have, perhaps unsurprisingly, been recorded from Clarendon Palace, just up the road. The absence of imports in Salisbury is all the more interesting and surprising, given the growing mercantile basis of the new city, which had close links with the port of Southampton. These links were apparently not reflected in an influx of exotic ceramics, despite the written evidence of the Southampton port books, which list consignments of pots transported from the port to Salisbury. Where did they go? But ideas and pots were nevertheless moving, and possibly also potters. And although there's nothing to suggest anything other than indigenous development at Laverstock, there remains the possibility that an existing industry, which we presume was based somewhere at Old Sarum, received renewed invigoration through the arrival of potters, or a potter or potters from elsewhere, and possibly coming in the train of Henry III's extensive renovations at Clarendon Palace. And this presumably could have equipped the industry to supply not just the new town, but also the Royal Palace itself. Okay, so what are the reasons behind these changes in ceramic production? There's probably a number of factors at play here, but really these boil down to 2 interconnected strands. That's the changing economic role of potting and the rise of markets. So between the 10th and 12th centuries, most pottery industries were small scale and were rurally based. They may have functioned without a permanent kiln. As you can see here in this reconstruction of a fairly simple clamp kiln at Domniat in Somerset. These very simple arrangements would have left very little trace in the archaeological record, by the way, so it's really difficult to pick them up. Manufacture was almost entirely by hand. The wheel was probably only adopted by potters who obtained a large proportion of their income from potting. Rural potters would almost certainly have spent most of their time in agricultural activities and merely supplemented that with potting. They would have been amongst the lower levels of society as well. The exception to this pattern at the period was Michaelmersh, which operated in the late 10th to 11th century entirely on wheel technology. But that industry is so alien to what was going on elsewhere in Wessex at the time that it may in fact have had other origins. My theory is that it might have been started by an immigrant potter or potters from the continent. And as the industry supplied Winchester, there may well have been a royal or other high status patronage involved. Now in this model of pottery supply at this period, the prevailing model, the typical industry prior to the 13th century supplied an area of about 10 miles in diameter or less, with a few supplying an area of up to 30 miles in diameter. But the pattern didn't remain static. By the 11th century, there are a number of industries operating across the West Country, to begin with mostly small scale, maybe just 1 or 2 potters. But over the period between the 11th and the 13th century, the number of potteries gradually declined and potters increasingly grouped together, into communities to produce for the market. Now, this is implied by the Westbury reference to the Domesday reference to Westbury, and by the documentary reference to Crockerton, where there were 23 potential potters in 1234, of which 13 were active. Distribution areas, which at the beginning of the period were limited and more or less mutually exclusive, gradually widened and overlapped more, but communities probably relied largely on local supplies, except for higher quality wares. And throughout, the table-wares in general travelled further than the coarse-wares. For example, Wessex coarse-ware pitchers, thought to have been made in the vicinity of Old Sarum, have turned up in Bristol and even in Dublin. The actual methods of marketing pottery at this time are uncertain, and it's likely that a lot of the distribution, both for commissions and for general sale, would have been by carting. That's a method still used by the Burwood pottery industry of Dorset into the early 20th century, although there could also have been sale at point of manufacture. And I'm deliberately using these examples from Burwood. Both these images are taken from the early part of the 20th century, in the Burwood area of East Dorset. And this is because the industry here was really still using medieval methods of production and distribution well into the post-medieval period and up to really the middle of the 20th century. Alternatively, there could have been some input by external entrepreneurs buying products of individual potters, and this could explain the wider distribution of some of the higher quality wares. Now, one of the problems we have to contend with here is that for the earlier period prior to the 13th century, we're not always sure whether we're dealing with the products of a single source, a kiln or group of kilns very close together, or a ceramic tradition in which very similar wares might be produced at several points over a wide area by potters all using similar resources and working in a similar style. A wide distribution is not necessarily a certain indicator of large-scale centralised production, as indeed we can see in the Burwood industry of East Dorset. However, from the ceramic record, it's clear that the biggest shift in pottery production in the Salisbury area came with the establishment of the Laverstock kilns in the 13th century, where a sizable community of potters can be inferred from the number of kilns, even if these were operating over perhaps a century. So these are more permanent structures in the form of updraft kilns, as we see here in this reconstruction, again from Donyat, either single flue or double flue. And this coincides with a general shift in production in the West Country in the late 12th to early 13th century. And it also happens to be the period, I'm sure it's not coincidental, in which market grants were the most numerous. So Salisbury's market charter was granted in 1227, and there was at one time a pot row in the market, presumably where potters offered their wares for scale. In something like this set up here, this is actually Minster Street, not the marketplace in Salisbury, at a much later period, but it gives you an idea of what might have been going on. So one reason for potters grouping together might have been to exploit the new expanding market, and this could in turn have provided the necessary conditions to allow specialisation, the adoption of new technology such as the wheel, and experimentation, which we can see in the proliferation of new types of pottery vessels. Now, interestingly, it does seem that wheel technology was not universally used at Laverstock, or it might be that it wasn't used right from the start, but only introduced a little later. Some of the vessels that we find are definitely handmade, and some appear to combine hand manufacture with perhaps the use of a turntable. Another problem we face here, and Phil mentioned this earlier on, is that our ceramic sequence from Salisbury, again, is more or less a palimpsest of what might have been going on from the 13th century right through the medieval period. We don't have a good, deep, stratified sequence from Salisbury, so it's very difficult to isolate pottery of specific dates within that overall period. Now, this is a very simplistic contrast here that I'm presenting. There may not have been imported pots in Salisbury, but certainly the proportion of tablewares in use in the city is high. And across the sites dug by Wessex archaeology, the proportion is around 25%. So this is based on sherd count, and it's counting the number of glazed sherds, the fine glazed sherds. And in contrast, the proportion from Gomeldon, which is a deserted medieval village 4.5 miles northeast of Salisbury, and occupied from the 12th to 13th century, probably early 14th century, is only about 5%. The range of vessel forms, which is what I've used here, gives that contrast again. So the fine wares from Salisbury here, and fine wares from Gomeldon here. In contrast, coarseware jars here, coarseware jars here. Gomeldon has a far larger collection of bowls and dishes, with other wares at the top. Interestingly, Gomeldon has slightly more coarseware jugs. And at the other extreme, we've got Clarendon Palace here, where in fact the range of coarseware, the proportion of coarseware jars is more or less constant, but look at that very high proportion of fine glazed wares there. That's not necessarily unexpected on such a high status site. So as I say, that's a very simplistic contrast using just one rural site and a royal palace, but it could be taken in support of the notion that there's a distinction between medieval urban and rural material culture, a distinction by which urban inhabitants chose luxury items, relying on the local market, where the rural population were more likely to purchase household assets in order to generate surplus. In this scenario, the inhabitants of rural and urban sites had differing ceramic requirements. The rural population needed pots for food preparation and storage, in other words, purely functional forms, whereas the urban population also required tablewares. This theory is debatable, and the situation was almost certainly more complex. A number of factors might have affected an individual's acquisition of portable goods, including but not restricted to ceramics, including economic factors, standard of living, purchasing power, the cost of an item and competing items such as metalware, and the choice available in the marketplace, which would obviously be largely in urban centres. So a relative lack of objects could just reflect distance from markets and cultural differences rather than poverty. And even highly decorated wares could have been affordable by a wide range of the population. And again, we have to remember here that we're only dealing with one part of the material culture as a whole. Pottery was relatively cheap in comparison with other material types such as metal and of course glass. So, to conclude, the evidence from Old Sarum and Salisbury gives us the opportunity to examine the changing role of potters and their products from the late Saxon period through to the 13th century, from small-scale manufacture, the limited and largely utilitarian repertoire supplied from a number of sources, to the predominance of a large-scale industry supplying a range of vessel forms, but with a suggestion of differentiation in marketing to the various levels of society. There's still much research to be done, and particularly from the period between the 10th and 12th centuries, but I hope this paper acts as a small contribution towards that. Thank you very much.